Our 3 Cents is a podcast series where myself and two of my very best gaming chums have been counting down our top 100 favourite video games of all time. Our lists are as eclectic as they come, but there are of course some games that will inevitably feature on all three of our lists. When this glorious moment of unification happens, we will produce one of these videos where we combine all three of our contributions from the podcast for a game that has officially been our 3 Cents approved. Minty, can you please tell us, what is your 91st favourite video game?
Yeah, I can. You'll notice the slight tinge of urgency, maybe even anger in my voice.
Do you need a wee?
No, that was just me priming you and the listeners for how this choice is going to go.
Okay.
You know the Nintendo Switch?
Yes.
We've been seeing a lot of definitive and deluxe editions of games, haven't we?
Yes, we have, Minty.
And it's mostly been just a way of companies making a quick buck, rehashing games that were popular on other systems.
Or were good games on unpopular systems, such as numerous Wii U games.
Yes. Now, this game comes from the PC. When I first started playing this game, it was a very well-rounded and critically acclaimed indie game, which is all that my laptop could handle. It was then re-released, revamped, rebirthed, I guess you could say.
There we go.
And then another expansion came out. That was good. And then this next expansion came, and it was probably one of the laziest expansions that I've ever come across in my life. Very, very few meaningful additions to the game. It boasted a huge new final level, which was just some kind of lazy conglomerate of all the existing assets in the game with a boss that was, upon release, just one single frame of animation.
What is it?
It's The Binding of Isaac Afterbirth Plus.
So for the sake of this, Minty, are you considering The Binding of Isaac Afterbirth Plus as a separate entry to, say, other versions of The Binding of Isaac?
Yes.
Almost as if this is The Binding of Isaac 2 or 1.5.
Sure. For what it did wrong and what it did right, it did provide so many subtle changes to the gameplay and added so many different things that it does become its own entity. I mean, for me, they are two incredibly different games, Rebirth and Afterbirth Plus. Rebirth was just a fantastic game, almost perfectly balanced. If we treat Afterbirth Plus as its own game, as it was on the Switch, it was a complete game. It was a definitive edition, as it were, but it was also bloated and messy. It was, for everything it promised, it just came off as a bit disappointing, and it didn't really build on what came before it in a very satisfying way.
So what you're saying is that Ed McMillan, in adding more, took more away.
By his own admission, he was scraping the bottom of the barrel.
I feel like as a designer, like I really like generally a lot of what he's put out over the years.
Oh, yes.
But he's not the best at restraint.
Quality control.
Yeah, and I feel like if that's the main criticism of Afterbirth, it's because he is not amazing at saying when something should stop if he feels like there is like a fan swell behind it.
There have been obviously even additional updates coming.
Yeah, the Switch is still getting patches with expansion content.
And it very much smacks of trying to dig yourself out of a hole.
The booster packs come from fan-made mods, don't they? So it's nothing to do with him at all. Which is good because it honours and validates the work that so many of the fans put in. Yeah. Something else that works against Afterbirth Plus is it came out around about the same time as Antibirth came out, which was what the community remix mod to the original game was to Rebirth. Absolutely fantastic. Blew it out of the water. It really did. So yeah, number 91, Afterbirth Plus. A really great game to begin with, but then just spoiled a bit.
But still a really good game. I've put a lot of hours into various iterations of Binding of Isaac myself, and I absolutely see what you mean. I think if there were sort of new people coming into the series, if Afterbirth Plus was their first interaction with any of the Binding of Isaac games, I think that's when you can kind of see its real flaws, because you're right, there is too much in there.
Yeah.
It's one thing if you've been playing it through its various kind of updates and remakes and being involved with some of the sort of the modding community sort of additional things, but when you look at all of that stuff that's in there with very little sort of handle on it to kind of get an idea of what's going on for a game which already kind of throws you in at the deep end with very little explanation in terms of what the sort of finer details of what the game does, then I think you'd be totally scared off.
Isn't there one more expansion still to come?
Apparently there is like one more final one to come, which is actually going to include Antibirth, which would be great. Whether or not that will be a free update to Afterbirth Plus. Sort of looking at the way that Ed McMillan has sort of relied on patching games and kind of slowly improving them in his mind or adding to them and to try and get it closer to what he wants it to be, it does make me wonder what the board game is going to play like when we really get into that. So we've had a couple of little games of it. He can't do anything to patch that.
No.
If he did, it would be such a huge operation.
To post cards around the world.
Yeah, exactly. Or just instructions and a free pot of Tipex.
Yeah, so it's been a weird old ride with the Binding of Isaac, but really, isn't the real ride the journey that we've all been on together and the friends that we've made along the way?
Well, there we have it. Our first dive into the realms of the Binding of Isaac. Will we see more later on? Probably.
Of all the games on my list, this is the one I feel least equipped to talk about, which is problematic because it's quite high on the list. But that is because I could write a spiel about this game and I could talk to like a very casual fan of the title, or I could try and sell someone completely new to it quite well. But my issue for this here and now is that this is a game that both of you have dominated across its many iterations and revisions.
Interesting.
And anything I say now is going to be challenged and questioned and fact-checked. And the progress I made through the game is probably like a tiny single-digit percentage of the collective hours you've both put in. And that's because it's The Binding of Isaac. So people know what this game is, I'm sure. Both of you do. Lots of other people will do. But if you don't, for some reason, it's a roguelike game. It's filled with scatological and religious imagery. It uses sort of the genre trappings of like the early Zelda flick screen dungeons, as well as like Smash TV or Robotron twin stick shooters. It's kind of like an amalgamation of those two styles. And because of the way it like reinvigorates itself in each play, you basically have a near infinite toy chest. You descend downwards through procedurally generated dungeon layouts, you kill all the enemies in a room, which allows you to travel to the next, and you collect power-ups and modifiers that will change your character's handling, weapon loadout, and by extension, your playstyle. And crucially, it's a game that I'm really bad at. It's a game that I never mastered or got close to mastering, like I know you both did. And it's a game that I'm not even close to having seen the end of either. But it is a game that I really, really admire and that I really, really enjoy. Now, Minty talked about one of this game's later revisions. Was it Afterbirth Plus on your list, Minty?
Yes.
So that was many, many episodes ago. And at the time, both of you had quite strong opinions on how Ed McMillan, like the primary developer and designer on the game, was kind of struggling to balance the amount of content he'd insisted on stuffing into it at that point. And whilst, like me, like I said, as the more casual player of this, could definitely see that viewpoint and understood where you were coming from, I put the majority of my playtime into maybe the initial flash release of the game when it was quite thin on the ground in terms of content. And by the time I got round to playing the Switch version of Afterbirth Plus, there was so much new stuff, it just felt like, I could just play this forever then. There's so much here, it would just go on forever.
Like F-Zero X's procedurally generated racetrack.
Exactly, but because it felt like there was such a big amount of content in comparison to what I was used to, it was so expansive that I wouldn't get bored in the amount of time I was going to play it for. That perhaps if you were really, really pushing to sort of get through it and become an absolute champion and unlock everything and find everything, you'd get annoyed at certain things not working how you wanted, or certain loadouts that basically made a run is just torpedoed as soon as you pick something up. And for me, I never really cared because it was just the joy of seeing something different every time. So basically, the criticisms that you probably rightly have about the game are offset by my own total lack of focus and ability. so you know, whereas like I mentioned, like the weapons or item bloat or whatever of the most recent revision might have made aiming for certain tasks or goals really frustrating. For me, it just meant that the game was going to keep refreshing itself. Like a basic run was just going to be different and different and different, and it was always something new to do. And for me, every time I started a playthrough, and this is going across the initial release on the PC, the Flash version, the Rebirth version when it came to the PS4 and the Vita, and then finally the Switch version, I was just always surprised, and I was rubbish at it, so a run wouldn't last that long. But it would be like, oh, a new boss variation, or oh, it's a new weapon that I've not seen before, or oh, I've got a new persistent unlockable that's going to change something, or a new enemy type, or a lucky build that meant I got that little bit further and actually got like to the end of that sort of portion of the run or whatever. In time, I'm sure that if I carried on playing, there would be things about this iteration of the game that would rankle in the same way, that would annoy me, but because I am Joe Average, I am just like the most average Binding of Isaac player in the world, it always felt like a really brilliant, addictive, challenging yet fair, thematically sprawling, quite well considered, rewarding, well-paced game. And I never got bored. And I mean, I played the Flash release back when it was, you know, quite limited, like I mentioned, for probably 15, 20 hours, I think. And although there were niggles at the time, like the engine didn't run amazingly well because it was just running in Flash, it also had this awful bug where certain antivirus softwares, including mine, would just delete your save file because it would erroneously identify it as malware because it was just attached to Flash. So it was stored in such a place that it just went in the bin. Like I said, I was rubbish at it, but I had unlocked enough that I felt quite annoyed when I logged on one day and it was like, oh, gone, just completely gone. And when it finally moved on to, like I said, when it got its port to consoles and its new engine with Rebirth, I got it on the Vita and the PS4 because I think it was on PlayStation Plus when it first came out, and it had like a cross-save feature, so you could do a bit on the console and then pick up the handheld and carry on. And I probably played another maybe 15, 20 hours from the start of the game then, before finally getting the Switch version. When I first got my console, I imported a copy of Afterbirth Plus before it had a UK release, and I played it for quite a lot longer. I think I did make more progress this time, but still never got to that point where I was seeing elements that wound me up as much as someone who really knew the game inside out. And it's a game that I really, really like. And because I am not this hardcore super fan, I'm just Mr. Regular, Mr. Casual, Mr. Why on earth are you still dying to the same enemy? Why won't you just fucking learn and stop doing that same error? It's like I don't have the same wider stock in the game outside of knowing that if I stick it on now for an hour, I'm going to have a really good time and probably see something new. It's a game that will change enough for me every time I play it that I haven't got bored of it yet. And that's why it lands where it does on the list, because I'd never got to that point where I was annoyed at the top end because I never got to that post-game part. So this is a real kind of, I don't know, an indication of how much I enjoyed it, that a game that I never made a humongous amount of progress through still ranks as highly as it does because the core loop of playing it was still fun for me at that stage.
Yeah.
And that's why it ends up being number 28. So officially, I've put Afterbirth Plus as this version. But to be honest, it's any of the ones I played, because I couldn't tell you what was added to this that wasn't in the last one, or what was in the vanilla release that was then taken out or modified or changed. It's just the collective Binding of Isaac is my 28.
Fantastic. No, I think you're right that looking at my total playtime across 4 different consoles or 4 different systems playing it is probably around about 700-800 hours.
Exactly.
And I was still happily playing it, even though there were things that I liked and didn't like. Like that, it's part of the charm of it, is that it is a bit of a mixed bag what you might get, and every room you go in is a new gamble.
Yeah.
And if you go into a bad room, it makes you more certain that the next room's going to be good. So it makes you want, weirdly, after getting kind of like shafted by one of Ed McMillan's stupid items, it makes you want to keep going more. And it's like, damn him for that, because that's like, how do you make that?
What it shows is just how addictive that gameplay loop is.
Yeah.
And I know like lots of roguelikes or roguelites, whatever they classify as, fall into that category for the same reason that you played Dead Cells for a million years. It's like the idea that things are different enough to keep it fresh, like doing the same run essentially is still fresh and enjoyable. And yeah, absolutely. For me as a semi-casual player, I think it was always fun because the amount I played, even though that probably amounts to 50, 60 hours across the different versions, I probably didn't see that many repeats. There's a ridiculous amount of content in that game.
Yeah.
And there's one last expansion coming that will take things out and change things around and add bits in or whatever. And it's just, I don't know how far this game can go before it is like at proper bursting point.
Yeah.
Where they have to just say, that's it. I don't even want to see it anymore.
I mean, I think it's past bursting point, and I think that's why there's loads of messy bits spilled everywhere, and like, oh, there's a new pool of stuff there, or there's a fresh intestine hanging on the wall there. That's actually a whole other expansion. But like with Ed McMillan putting more stuff in and more stuff in, some of it's good, some of it's not so good, some of it I like, some of it I don't like. And I think everybody's going to have different opinions on that as well.
Yeah.
And I mean, I absolutely cannot wait for the final expansion, because that's bringing with it the fan-made, what's it called, Minty?
Anti-Birth.
Anti-Birth, that's it. I can't wait for that, even though, I've put in, like I said, hundreds of hours into the game and have, sort of worn tired of the game a couple times in those sessions, as you would do for putting 300 or 400 hours into it. Obviously, Georgia didn't get that memo with The Sims, but as an aside, contrary to what Chris said last week about how she's put nearly 2,000 hours in, it turns out it's actually 3,500 hours, which is fair play.
Absolutely.
That thing you said about the gameplay loop, that is completely spot on, and just the slow trickle of unlocked things for just having an average level of skill. Like, it's tantalizing. It's absolutely tantalizing. It keeps drawing you back, and the deftness with which some items create synergies with each other, that is the real strength of the game, and that's all I'm going to say about it.
Yeah, because even if you've played through the game and seen every item that is available, you haven't seen how every item interacts with every other item, because you're not a billion years old. So, moving on, we have Minty's game. Minty, can you please tell us about your 11th favourite video game of all time?
Yes, I can. Something I've been thinking about a lot is how when you get stronger in video games, it's usually in a very British way. It's calm, it's restrained, and it's done the proper way. This collectible gives you more health in small increments. Here's a sharper sword. The bullets in this new gun are better for killing. Here's a cloak that can stop the bite of a wolf, etc. It's a very gradual progression from like nearly getting killed by a rat to kicking the shit out of a god. It's always very satisfying when you think back over how far you've come over the course of the game. Or even in the late stages of a story where you're stripped of your powers in some sort of villainous subterfuge and you're on your own in a very high level area trying to find your gear or whatever. Really helps you appreciate what you have and who your friends are.
That you've made along the way.
Today's game is nothing like that. Well, it is most of the time, but all bets are off for the progression of your survivability. You're not swapping out weapons for the next sort of upgraded version or donning a new hat and shoes. Everything you collect is added to your arsenal, and if they work a little bit too well together and manage to just destroy hordes of enemies with a single button press in the first few minutes of the game, then all the better. This was my very first indie game, one that was made in Flash, if you can believe that.
I can.
I can believe
Yeah,
it.
I knew nothing about this game until I just saw a trailer for it, pretty much on accident, which in turn explained very little about the game itself. But in about a minute and a half has been unsurpassed in capturing the very essence of a game and the mood of it. It's a game that uses snowballing as its core mechanic, and one that has snowballed as a little franchise now. It's the original Binding of Isaac.
Whee!
Yeah.
The original.
Lovely.
Released furtively on Steam in 2011, this strange and sad little game has you fleeing your fanatical mother before she kills you. nice, cheery synopsis. Escaping through your basement, you run further and further, deeper and deeper until you're confronted with the devil himself. Instead of weapons, you fight enemies by firing your tears at them. And all you have to arm yourself is just little bits of tat and shit you find along the way that make you sadder.
Quite literally.
Yeah. Instead of powering you up, they'll make you sadder, they'll make you sicker, or have some sort of weird religious significance. For example, the corpse of your pet cat gives you 9 lives because cat. Onions make you cry. We know this about onions. So if you find one in the basement, it makes you fire out your tears quicker. There's even a Ouija board that turns up sometimes as well. That'll give you a really scary ghost face and let your tears pass through solid objects. And all these things work together. You're not swapping them out for each other. So you can end up in this instance with a Gatling gun of ghostly tears powered by onions and cat.
Cat.
I'm not for a second saying that the Flash Binding of Isaac is better than the remake. That would be insane. Rebirth is a polished realization of the original, and it's nearly flawless in execution and balance. But the context in which I first encountered the original makes it incredibly special to me. It was a first step into the near limitless potential of an entire cosmos of games made by plucky teams of passionate and sometimes even amateur developers. So yeah, where would we be without those first steps into broader and brighter worlds? I also much prefer the compact clarity of the iconography of the original game. As I mentioned definitely in Afterbirth Plus, there's a bit of sort of item bloat. There's
A bit.
yeah,
Oh.
just a slice.
It's a veritable hippo.
Yeah, just a. With the item bloat, I've often lamented in later iterations of the game, there comes a weird muddiness to the symbolism of the Isaac verse, I guess. By the time I stopped playing Afterbirth Plus, you didn't know whether it was all a dream, whether he was crazy, or whether it was just him using his imagination to cope with the fact that he was in a domestically abusive situation. And I think the real tightness of the item pool and all the items that you can get, these are just mundane things. They're not silly things like a sprinkler with an eyeball on it. They're just things that you find in your house. You can find them. You can find a knife in the kitchen. There might be maybe a knife that's fallen through the floorboards in the basement. That's something that you could feasibly find. If you're crawling about underneath your house. I think it's that sort of that believability of the things you find, just elevated a notch through the imagination of a child who is coping with some with quite a traumatic event. It gives it a real tightness, which I really love. Afterbirth Plus is already on my list, and Repentance will probably take its place when it finally comes out.
Oh yeah.
It's great now that it's all gussied up, but the original, such a perfect little thing. It's a delicious, mournful little morsel that showed me you don't need an established team working on a beloved franchise to produce good games. There's so many out there, and I really love and appreciate the original Binding of Isaac for sort of planting that seed and that drive to just take the plunge on little things that could turn out to be rubbish, but most of the time are very good because they're made by people who just love what they're doing. It's good and it's nice, and it's also what started me buying indie games as well, so I appreciate it for that.
That's brilliant.
Wonderful. I remember when we lived together, seeing you playing it on your laptop a lot.
Yeah.
And I believe the sentiment I expressed when looking at it is, I can't see any element of that game that makes me want to play it.
Famous last words.
Yep. We'll come to understand why at a date later in the future.
I mean, I was similar to you, Minty. I saw a trailer for the original Binding of Isaac. I don't know where, on some games website. I imagine it was probably covered because obviously Ed McMillan had success with Super Meat Boy, and people were just kind of like latching on to what he was going to do next. But I was drawn in the same way. I downloaded that as soon as it came out on Steam, and obviously have not had the same storied history with the game that you both have. But I really loved it. All the things you say about how sort of compact, but how the game snowballs as you play, was there from the start. And as much as that might have gone a bit overboard as it's developed, I think the core of what makes that game so fun to play was always there from the initial Flash release onwards.
It was the first roguelike that I played. It was my first introduction to that genre or subgenre of games as well. Like, and it's a difficult thing to understand until you play. Like you were saying, Minty, about like the game not having a huge apocalyptic threat. The stakes aren't necessarily incredibly high because, well, for one, you don't know if the story of the game is happening in reality or in the imagination of the child, but also because if you die, you can just do it again. So the stakes can't be that high because the worst it can get is that you die and you try again.
Yeah.
And that's something that I just couldn't really comprehend, really. I think when I first saw it, just being like, well, what's the point then? What's the point? Point. The point.
The point is to play and have fun.
Exactly. The point is to play and have fun. So, in the words of the walrus in Alice in Wonderland, the time has come! Are you guys ready to hear what my 10th favourite video game of all time is?
Lay it on us.
Yes!
2 weeks ago, Chris opened his thoughts on Sonic 3 and Knuckles by saying that it was a game that had appeared on my list twice.
I did.
Well, it's my turn this week to say that my 10th favourite game is a game that has appeared on Minty's list twice.
Oh.
And indeed, once on Chris's.
Oh, okay.
Oh, wow.
And it's interesting that you said that the games in our top 10 are like family, for the most recent and precious addition to my family is a little baby. And my game this week is Ed McMillan's cry-em-up roguelike, The Binding of Isaac.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
So I definitely feel like you two have raised the bar with the glorious depths you've gone to regale us with your particular relationships with your 10th favourite video games of all time. And in truth, I struggled to sort of put together my thoughts on The Binding of Isaac because it's quite difficult to really nail the crux of what makes the game so fun, like to me, and what gave me cause to put, literally almost 1,000 hours into it.
Insane.
But I thought a good place to begin with my time with this game was the beginning of my time with it. And I mentioned this when it appeared on Minty's list, that I'd seen Minty put hour upon hour into it every evening on our sofa when we lived together. I'd only seen him playing it, and, I'd gathered information on the game through that and what little Minty had mentioned of it. And I remember distinctly thinking, I don't see anything about this game that I would enjoy. And this essentially came down to my lack of understanding of the roguelike genre, and I couldn't get my head around why that would be appealing. Of course, to anyone who's listened to my thoughts on roguelikes over the last 2 years on this podcast, it will surprise you that I wasn't initially sold on the concept. But I thought, who would want to play a game where you have to start all over again every time, where things aren't where you remember them, where it was a constant gamble between having fun and being dicked on by the developers? But much like the long nights of looking after my 10-week-old baby, the constant presence of this distraught infant in my periphery, I guess, slowly gnawed away at me. In my time between seeing Binding of Isaac and properly playing it, my understanding of the game grew, but also my friendship with Minty did also. And by the time it landed on the eShop on the new 3DS, I failed to believe that something that was treasured so deeply by one of my dearest friends would not also have an impact on me. For the hundreds of hours that Minty had poured into it, I also couldn't argue with the £12-ish price point. it would turn out that this would give me the equivalent value of about 3p an hour, given the time I would squeeze into the 3DS iteration. So it's a purchase I can't say I begrudge making. And I was already familiar with Ed McMillan's work in the form of Super Meat Boy, and so I knew his flash-style aesthetics and his fondness for the crude and immature, and his intense predilection for the expulsion of bodily fluids. And Binding of Isaac doubled down on everything he'd done before in that sense. All of the enemies in Binding of Isaac are just the manifestation of a rebellious infant doodling in their school books. I mean, literally anything that could possibly be a poo or a wee or a bum or something that could be fed to something else or something that could be aborted. I mean, literally in the first level, you're likely to come across an actual floating, coughing arsehole. Is it funny? Yes, but it is everywhere. But yeah, it's amazing how quickly you get desensitized to it, because the design of the enemies and the bosses just become representative of their abilities and their patterns. And so you start to ignore the floating turds and pissing wounds that are attacking you and just see particular movement patterns and their respective radii of attacks, and the spots in each room you can move to next to avoid taking damage and get your attacks in. Something that is quite fun to do is talk about the game to people who have never encountered it, because on its literal content alone, it sounds monumentally unappealing. I mean, I remember mentioning just the title of the game to one of my church-going friends, just in passing, just quite casually, and it said, sorry, there's a game of the Binding of Isaac. This refers to a point in the Bible when Abraham took his son up to the top of the mountain to murder him because God didn't say Simon Says. Mm-hmm. It's a Bible story that, upon reflection, probably should not be the basis for the founding of one of the three major monotheistic religions, but those people can make peace with their manipulative, infanticidal deity in their own way, and indeed in their own time. It's not for me to judge. In case you've got this far into the podcast without hearing Minty talk about the game twice, Chris talk about it once, in addition to the times we've mentioned it in passing, or if you've never stumbled across it or a roguelike before, here's the York notes. The Binding of Isaac is a game played from a top-down perspective in the style of classic 2D Zelda games. You move from room to room, defeating the enemies in there until you get to the boss of the floor, and you keep descending through a variety of floors until you die or beat Mum or Satan or one of the other final bosses. You play as a baby called Isaac who fires his tears as his attacks in one of the 4 cardinal directions. Every time you play the game, it will be different, from the room designs and their layouts, to the enemy placements and the bosses, to the floors themselves. It's randomly generated, so you'll have a fresh experience every time, which is just as well, because every time you die, you go back to the beginning again. The thing that really shakes this up, though, is the items that you collect to augment Isaac's abilities. These range from simple buffs to increase the fire rate of your tears, or their power or size, increase your speed, gain extra health, make more money, and then there's more extravagant things such as spawning a poo every time you're hit, spawn flies when you kill things, grow wings and fly, become immune to spikes on the floor, cough up blood, turn into a cat. I mean, literally anything. Those really are the most basic examples. I mean, you can also pick up familiars that will orbit you or move independently to aid you. You can find collectibles such as tarot cards that can generate things or warp you about the level. There are the signs of the zodiac you can find that will obscurely mirror their respective sign in the form of an ability. There's about 600 items in the game now, and the absolutely mental thing is that pretty much all of them can interact with the others. Sometimes, there will be 2 that won't really affect how the other works, but others will synergize to the point of breaking the game. Just as an example, the Tammy's Head item, which when you use it would fire tears in 10 directions around you, sort of just a nice big burst attack. And then if you pick up the Technology item, which turns your tears into laser beams, when you use Tammy's Head, you would now fire 10 laser beams around you instead, so they sort of stack. And that can also stack with, say, the Spoonbender item, which adds a homing effect to your tears, and then your laser beam bursts would also home in on the various enemies in the room, and so on, and so on. There's also a whole bunch of characters to unlock, all of which have different starting stats, different items. There are a bunch of different endings to find by following different routes through the game. There are additional challenge modes and daily runs. There's hard mode, greedier mode. You've got so many options to choose from depending on how you want to play or what sort of run you want to have. Now, I'll state that I'm talking about the most recent version of Binding of Isaac here, which is Afterbirth Plus on the Switch, which is the game that appeared on Chris's list, and also the first version of Binding of Isaac that appeared on Minty's list way back when, which we've said before, it contains so much content that it has turned the game into more of a bloater than the streamlined Rebirth version I played on the 3DS. And it appears that patches and bits of content are still being added. Like, I've done a few runs of this in the last week, and I'm still finding new enemies and new items and collectibles too. It's absolutely mad. And it also means that it's almost impossible to remember what does what. I mean, certainly on a specific level. And this is something that I thought provided a bit of a high bar to entry in Rebirth. I was so intimidated by the sheer volume of things in the game, I would never get my head around it. But the more I played and the more I watched various runs on YouTube, the more I picked up. And chiefly, I learnt most of the ins and outs of the game from Minty. And having his encyclopedic knowledge to hand to ask him what all the items did was just insanely useful, before I made the potential error of picking up soy milk or Matt's kidney stone. And even though I've poured hundreds of hours into the game between its various forms, I still can't tell you what everything does, and I can't remember the specific stat boosts of certain items. But similar to the way that the design of the enemies and bosses become secondary to them just being indicators of their movement and attack patterns, I found that the items in the game just tend to get stored into one of two columns in my brain, good items and bad items, and I'll know from seeing the item whether or not I want to pick it up or not, even if I can't remember exactly what it does. And it's the same with like the smaller things you collect as well, such as keys and bombs and money. You see them as numbers rather than items. You know that you'll need to have a couple of keys on every floor to unlock the shop and the treasure room, or you'll mentally keep track of marked rocks hidden among regular rocks that could contain soul hearts that you see, and making sure you have enough bombs to destroy them, whilst also saving enough bombs to try and find the hidden rooms on each floor. And yeah, with your coins, you know that if you have 15 coins, you can buy one of the big items in the shop, so it might be worth using a key to do that. Or if you have 5 coins and you need a bomb, you could use a key to open the shop and buy a bomb. It's constantly a mental workout as you keep track of how you're playing. And that, for me, is what makes it endlessly entertaining and engaging to play. And despite the enormity of the items in the game, there are a few personal favourites of mine. Some that, like, if you come across them, it gives you such a boost. I mean, not only just in terms of stats and abilities, but just in terms of confidence. Like, if you see the magic mushroom item in a room, I mean, it's a great item, it boosts all your stats. But it's just such a positive beacon that it makes you play better going forward. Because every time you go into a treasure room, you fought your way through, on the pedestal in the middle, it could be E. coli, or it could be a shitty nappy, or it could be a one-up mushroom, and that, the joy that it gives you seeing an item that you really, really want is just absolutely sensational. I had a run the other day where I picked up 3 of my favourite items within the first 4 floors, I think. And on the first floor, I picked up Death's Touch, which increases your damage, allows your tears to go through enemies, and it turns them into cool little scythes. And then on the second floor, I picked up 2020, which sees you fire double tears next to each other, effectively doubling your damage and your attack radius. And then on the 4th floor, I found the Super Meat Boy Circular Saw, which, similar to the 1-Up Mushroom, boosts all of your stats. There's also the Jacob's Ladder item, which was a real favourite of mine back in the Rebirth days on the 3DS, which it electrifies your tears, sending laser beams scattering around the room wherever your tears land, and it just causes loads of splash damage to all the enemies. It's like a really good, quick room clearer. I absolutely love it. So there's collections of items as well on certain themes, and if you collect enough of an item of a certain theme, you'll get a specific transformation. One of these is being able to transform into Guppy, Isaac's dead cat, after you collect 3 of the Guppy items. And then you can fly about and spawn blue flies, which automatically go and attack enemies for you. Brimstone. That was like my first favourite item. And basically it turns your tears into a chargeable death ray. And if you got that, I always felt, that's it. This run, I've got it. Don't worry, I've got this one sorted. Like, it allows you to keep distance from enemies whilst also just attacking with loads of damage. It's great. Cricket's head. The head of Isaac's dead dog. Fairly simple. Big damage buff. I love finding the small rock, which is another damage boost and something else you could potentially find inside one of the marked rocks. I mean, there's so many. And sometimes you'll be on the lookout for a specific item, because you know it's going to synergize well with another one that you've already got, transforming an item that might usually leave you nonplussed into one item that brings you inordinate joy. I've also got a few personal favourite characters to do runs as. Mainly is a character you unlock called the Lost, which I find to be like the purest way of playing the Binding of Isaac, because the Lost has no health. So if you get hit, you die. But you start with an item that allows you to take one hit per room. So as long as you're careful, you're fine. And you can fly, so you can hover over rocks and stuff to steer well clear of enemies. And because the Lost has no health, it means that items you get from devil rooms, which usually cost hearts to buy, you get these for free. And these are the items that are really powerful and stacked together really nicely. So all you need to do is get through a few floors, get a few devil deals, and you're hot to trot. And I mean, the day I defeated the Delirium boss with the Lost on hard mode is one of my prouder achievements, because that whole floor and boss is such a lazy clusterfuck of a design that usually you can't avoid taking a few hits in the boss fight, but I managed it, and that was great.
That's incredibly impressive.
Thank you.
Wowee.
I also like doing runs as Isaac after you unlock the D6 starting item, which allows you to re-roll the items in the treasure rooms if you don't like what the game spat out for you, which it just, felt like it gave you a bit more of a sense of control over the game. Judas is just a great character to run as. He only has one heart container to start with, but he's nice and fast, and he's got good starting damage. Also starts with the Book of Belial item, which increases your damage even more when you use it. So it's very useful for giving you a temporary damage boost for boss fights. I remember when I started playing the game and I said to Minty, what's the difference between the characters? And you said, well, you have Isaac starts with these sort of average stats. Magdalene starts with, she's got 4 hearts, and also her starting item is a yum heart, so you can use that to regenerate a heart. I was like, right, so she's got the most health. And you were like, yes. And I said, right, so she's the best then. No. I was like, I don't understand. No, I think Judas is the best. But he starts with 1 heart. Yes. Oh, I don't get it. I do get it now. I mean, since playing The Binding of Isaac and since writing these lists, I've been pretty spoiled when it comes to roguelikes, chiefly in the form of Dead Cells and Hades, which, to be honest, both provide much slicker roguelike experiences. None of the bloat that we see in Afterbirth Plus. They've definitely learnt things from The Binding of Isaac and other early roguelikes to create tighter, more consistently enjoyable gaming experiences. Because whilst, yes, you can get the items you want in the early floors of Isaac, you can get totally shafted by Ed McMillan's puerile sense of humour and get stuck with items that make you weaker or pick up things you don't know what they do or how to use them. And it can make the game a real slog until you either die or find something to power you up again. But the thing that the game does do is make it so that you're never too far away from turning your fortune around. The next treasure room could have a run-defining item in it. If you can beat the next boss, you could get a great item, or you could open up a devil room or an angel room to get another transformative item. So if you open a treasure room to find a piece of shitty toilet paper, you can always find a reason to press on and just try the next room, no matter how many floors in a row you're being hard done by. And when the worst comes to the worst and you die, with just a press of a button, you can start again and maybe your luck will change in the first floor of a new run. And it means that the game has instant replayability because it almost instantly satiates your curiosity constantly through the game. And this makes for an incredibly addictive experience. I mean, there are so many elements of the game that I still haven't really got my head around. Now, I've completed normal, hard, greed, and greedier mode with all of the endings for all of the characters, except one, which is the Keeper, a character that uses money as health, and is a weird mechanic that sees you not be able to increase your overall health beyond 2, I think. And I just couldn't get my head around how to play as him, apart from in greed mode, where coins are more forthcoming, and I managed to complete a run as him on that. Speaking of greed mode, this was another mode that I remember seeing Minty play before I played just the normal game at all, and it looked so phenomenally overwhelming that I was totally put off. But the mode is actually brilliant, and it basically turns the game into more of an arcade experience. It's sort of streamlines and concentrates the game, compresses a full run's worth of play into a few minutes. And once I figured out how it worked, it was, insanely fun. And again, it satisfied that curiosity so quickly and so frequently that you could just find yourself playing it for run after run after run. I remember when I unlocked the Apollyon character after defeating Mega Satan for the first time, and he starts with a really, really cool item called Void. And this took me a while to get my head around, as it basically consumes an item in the room it's used in. And if it's an active item, like, say, an item that fires a barrage of tears, or it warps you to a random room, it will add that ability to its own. So when you use it in the future to consume another item, it will activate all of its banked active abilities at once. And if you use Void to consume a passive item, like an item that will increase your health or up your damage, it will instead give you 2 random stat buffs, which is great for when you find items that you don't really want or you don't have a use for. And it means that you can put together these insane builds with this insanely overpowered and complex item. It's absolutely brilliant, and it's quite mind-bending. I think the key to my enjoyment of this game also comes down to a couple of other factors, and that's the hardware I played it on. I didn't see the appeal of playing it on a computer, certainly not using a keyboard to control it, which I know is how Minty predominantly played it. As you know, I'm a staunch believer in the fact that first-person games should be played with a mouse and keyboard, but I'm also of the belief that anything else should be played with a controller. The fact that it got a port to the 3DS and used the second screen to keep track of your stats was a huge draw for me, and the fact that I could pick it up and play it for 5 minutes here and there, I could do a run or two in bed, sneak in a few minutes of play under my desk at work. It was great, and I was gutted when I got my head around Rebirth that I knew that console, even the new 3DS, would never be able to handle the additional content in Afterbirth that I saw Minty playing on the PC. But then Afterbirth Plus arrived on the Switch, and I imported it from the US a couple of weeks after getting the Switch itself, because I knew that I was about to make a purchase that was going to give me the equivalent of about 7p an hour. Admittedly, not quite as good value as Rebirth on the 3DS, but I still remember being stationed in North Wales whilst I was co-creating a musical with a theatre up there, and playing on my Switch every night in my friend's house before bed, every morning before getting up, occasionally sneaking in a few runs during downtime in rehearsals. It's the perfect pick-up and play game. I love this game for all of its flaws, for all of its great, great strengths. It's a genuine joy to get your head around, to learn all of the different patterns in the game, to learn all of the different secrets, the different rules for where hidden rooms tend to be, what the different colours of enemies mean, what you need to do to unlock the boss rush after the mum fight, how you unlock your way to defeat the Hush boss, how you find your way to Satan or the Blue Baby or Mega Satan, how the heck greed mode works and how you can use it to your advantage. What on earth is Isaac crying for? Having dived back into it for quite a few runs this week, I can say that the appeal and addictiveness of this game is still as potent as it ever was. And I know that when the final Repentance expansion lands, I'm going to have no problem probably ploughing another 300 or 400 hours into the game to play through all of the new content. All of the content from Antibirth that I've still never played, which was the fan mod, which is now being sort of taken on and legitimised. I absolutely can't wait. It was literally announced this week that the release date for the expansion is 31st of March this year. And I'm assuming that's for PC, so I don't know when it's going to find its way to consoles. But in anticipation, I've started playing through my digital PAL copy of The Binding of Isaac Afterbirth Plus so that I can get the DLC from the European eShop and it will be compatible because, well, I bought Binding of Isaac on the eShop even though I had the cartridge from America, but the save didn't transfer across because it reads it as 2 different editions, so I'm assuming it'll be the same with buying the DLC. And it's a shame to put aside, obviously, all of my progress from my American copy save, but I've also really enjoyed just doing a whole bunch of runs afresh, discovering the characters again. Even though I've done it thousands of times, I still get that same satisfaction out of getting a good build, ticking the various things off the list in the game. It's wonderful. It is like family to me. It's my 10th favourite video game of all time, as my wife likes to call it. It's the crying baby game.
We love that crying baby game.
It's a good one.
I'm so excited for Repentance.
Maybe you both know more about this than I do. Because this next expansion adds a lot of extra stuff again, and it also has this element of the anti-birth fan mod being folded into it, does that mean the next edition will have more? Will it have less? Will it take out what was in it before? Like, I can't get my head around how the different expansions work anymore.
So this expansion basically gives you, for every floor in the game, like the basement, the one after it, the one after that, etc. There's another version of it. So you've got, along with the depths and the necropolis, I think you then got the mausoleum.
Okay.
Which has a really, really cool sort of like cathedral at nighttime aesthetic. That's really nice. The caves has the mines as well, which has a lava aesthetic.
And minecarts.
There's one that's it's called Downpour.
Oh yeah.
They're really, really good. They've got all kinds of new enemies that are sympathetic of their place in the game, what floors they're on. They've got new bosses that are really, really good as well. Yeah, a whole bunch of new items and new bosses. It's going to be great. I honestly think that Antibirth is probably a better expansion than Afterbirth Plus. So, I can't wait. Can't wait for it.